Hello, this is Peter Kovacek, and this presentation is on the productive clinic. We'll be looking at a topic related to improving productivity, and the basis for all this will be to improve productivity without sacrificing quality. This focus today in this presentation will be on systems, uh, systems issues within organizations, within your department. And in order to get started, we need to talk about the fact that there is a critical question to ask, and that is, who's the productive therapist? And to look at this, we need to recognize that many different people can be productive, depending on the setting and the systems in place. And the corollary of that is that some people can't be productive no matter what the systems or settings are in place. We're going to try to avoid overgeneralizations in this discussion, but there will be the necessity at times to overgeneralize just so we can make the point quickly. And as we look at this entire topic of productivity, one of the key questions is, what can the typical worker do to be more productive? Not the top 10% that are going to be productive no matter what you do, and the bottom 20% that are never going to be productive no matter what you do. So the question is, what's the productive clinic? Now, given the right people, any system can work. And given the wrong people, every system will fail. So we're going to ask the question here, what systems are most likely to enhance productivity for the typical worker? And that answer is going to depend on every individual location, organization, association, the politics, the structures that are in place within any company. So what does it mean to be productive? Simply, it means getting more done, but the question is, more of what? And that's a crucial question. The values are going to determine for you what's important for your clinic, and you need to really address that issue. But in almost all settings, at least to some extent, revenue is part of that equation of what's important. That is related to what are the things that we do that generate revenue. It could be treatments or visits or cases, or it could be, in a capitated world, it could be lives covered. So when we look at the productive clinic, we're looking at what systems are best for the typical worker. And systems should be thought of as the environment in which the work is done. These systems can enhance or they can detract from the ability to be productive, but no one size is going to fit all, and that no one clinic, no one system is going to be right for every single clinic. As we look at the issue of financial success, there really are 4 steps to it, and these are going to be important to understand. The first one is the organization has to be able to do optimal quality. They have to be able to do good work. The second one is they have to be able to do enough quantity, enough of that good work, that it makes sense to do it and is sustainable. Thirdly, they have to get reimbursed for it, and that's becoming more and more of a challenge every day in healthcare. And lastly, they have to be able to contain their costs. So if an organization successfully provides optimal quality, does an adequate quantity, gets paid, and controls their cost, most organizations would consider that to be financially successful and will probably lead to an excess of revenue over expenses. When we look at that formula, it is important to recognize that cost reduction only has 4 options. And in order to reduce the cost of care, we can do one of, or more of 4 things. We can provide less care. That means fewer visits, shorter visits, but less overall care. Secondly, we could lower our payroll costs by giving payroll cuts, or we could hire cheaper people, or cheaper types of people. We could lower our supply costs for paper and toner and TheraBand, but in reality, in most therapy clinics, that's not a big percentage of the overall expenses of the organization. That could be different if it was a wound care or other type of clinic. Or lastly, we can accept less profit, and that is probably not a long-term sustainable solution. So the 4 options to lower costs are less care, lower cost care, lower supply costs, or less profit. Key to this discussion, we have to ask the question of what degree of recovery can we afford? And we look at something called the patient recovery continuum, and we recognize that over the course of time along the bottom axis, the patient's rate of improvement along the vertical axis is likely to change. And although every patient has their own path, this blue line is a fairly typical descriptor of of what happens for a typical patient in therapy is that initially they have a relatively quick rate of return. It slows down a little bit and then eventually does something that we call plateauing. Obviously, the third-party payers are in the business of trying to drive that green arrow to the left so that there's less care. The problem with that is there's also less improvement. There's also the realization that early on there's probably a higher return on investment because the rate of improvement is quicker, because there typically are some easy things that we can do from a functional standpoint. And then towards the end, near that plateau on the right, there's a point at which the payer may see little value in continuing rehabilitation. And obviously we're seeing that pressure being very, very strong pressure driving us all to the left. It is important for us to understand that this is a real situation. It's happening every single day with every single patient. And in a situation where healthcare costs are perceived as being out of control, this is going to be looked at over and over again. One of the questions we have to ask and hopefully be able to answer is, what degree of recovery do we think we can afford? Now, there are some factors that affect productivity, including systems within your clinic. These systems are related to management activities, clinical activities, and clerical activities, but no one system change will work in every setting. We're going to look at some of the different types of management and clinical and clerical systems, specifically in this video, but we'll look very intensely at clinical systems when we look at the productive therapist, which is the individual clinical behaviors that will be happening for next week. It's important that we say this out loud, and it's important that staff understands it, and that is that productivity and quality are not mutually exclusive. In most industry, quality increases as productivity increases, and that's true to a point. To increase productivity, don't assume, however, that the staff can just work harder. The example I always give is that if I was trying to be a high jumper, someone telling me to jump higher is not helpful. I understand that. And for a manager to tell their staff, well, just work harder, get more done. The question is, how do you do that? One of the things that we look at is we look at systems that may need to be changed to become more efficient and less error prone or less time wasting. But there's also some personal behaviors, which we'll talk about next time. To make systems more efficient, they need to be thoroughly analyzed and standardized and understood. So one of the questions is, what systems are a challenge for you? We have a worksheet in the to be downloaded from Moodle that takes a look at these and gives you a chance to analyze them yourself. We'll be talking a little bit about management systems, some office systems, and some clerical systems. So here are some of the management systems that we typically see that are problems from an organizational standpoint. This could be things such as management structure, strategic planning, staff development, manager development, retention and recruitment activities, marketing and public relations. Meetings is in all caps because it's almost always an issue. Policy development and maintenance, accreditation compliance, creation of management reports, payroll processing, supply purchasing, communication infrastructure. All those are possible systems, and there's many more. But we'll look at a couple of those as examples, but some of those may be ones that are really an issue for you. And if they are, one of the questions will be, is it enough of an issue that you should be looking at it? And is it likely that it can be fixed in a timely and meaningful way? The first one we're going to look at is management structure. Now, management structure is very mundane, but it's critical to efficiency. This has to do with how many layers of an organization there are. The philosophical discussion is the difference between leadership versus interference versus apathy. And there's a tremendous amount of time that's spent feeding the organizational structure machine. And every layer that you have means that there's another layer that has to have basically someone paying homage to a leader. The role of professionals in this is a very interesting discussion outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but it is something that I think that everyone should give some thought to. It is also a critical decision, and we're seeing lots of organizations get flatter. In other words, that the span of control is getting wider. Each leader or manager is responsible for a larger number of individuals. That has some advantages in terms of flattening out the organization. It certainly does from a cost standpoint. It may or may not from an efficiency standpoint. Another one of the systems is the policy and procedure development. We see lots of managers that have tremendous amounts of time spent on this, and these are all related to things like accreditation compliance and the difference between competence and compliance and the manager versus the leader. There's lots and lots of issues here. Every time you write a policy and procedure, there's a training component. Staff has to be aware of it. There's also the ability to assure that people are following that. There should be a balance between interference and liability and professional autonomy. But these can take tremendous amounts of time and can be a tremendous source of frustration. And when the staff has identified what they might call, quote, a stupid policy, there's time spent on resistance, there's energy wasted, and it can be a true something that really decreases productivity and certainly decreases morale. One of the other ones that we want to talk about very briefly here are reporting processes. There's time that's spent in creating reports and reading reports and using reports and ignoring reports. And one of the things I would suggest that people take a look at if you're spending time creating reports is what is the process by which you are creating them. But also if you stopped doing these reports, would anyone notice, and would it matter? In many organizations that I've worked with as a consultant, I've seen lots of times when the manager was creating reports that no one even knew they were creating, and in some cases it represented a substantial part of their week. So take a very quick, very quick but somewhat thorough look at the time that you're spending looking at reports, creating reports, even something as simple as filing reports, and all those systems can really interfere with your ability to get work done as a manager, but also as an organization as a whole. Meeting effectiveness. Meetings are always a problem when it comes to productivity. A lot of folks understand that meetings are one of the highest frustration and biggest time wasters as perceived by staff. One of the key pieces is what we call interface principles that come into play here, and that is if I waste time, I waste my time. If I have a meeting with 3 other people, I waste my time and theirs. So 4 times as much time is wasted. So there's multiple time commitments and risks that are involved. What we would encourage you to do is really look at meeting management as a discipline and use principled meetings with agendas and time targets and critique of the meeting, which I would consider to be a quality improvement approach to meetings. And one of the other questions is if you're coming together for a meeting, you have a purpose, but what's the best mechanism to accomplish that purpose? Is it a meeting, or are there other options? There's tons of literature on meetings and in the management literature, and hopefully you'll have a chance to review that. Looking at clinical systems, there's all kinds of clinical systems that are here related to staff development and continuing education and clinical education and aid and tech training and use, and documentation is part of that. Staff scheduling, patient transport, supply purchasing, program development, clinical efficiency, and third-party relations. We're going to talk about a couple of those just very briefly. One of the big ones would be documentation systems, and let's look at their purpose, some technology considerations, some personnel considerations, and some realistic expectations when it comes to documentation systems. The purpose of documentation is multifold. First, it is to communicate to others, but some people will also use their notes as a way to communicate to themselves, to remind them of what's going on with a specific patient situation. There's also a liability issue, a legal component to this. In our litigious society, we have documentation to make sure that we have a record of what occurred. There certainly is a reimbursement component, and in this era of audits and more audits and RAC audits and all other kinds of things, our documentation is certainly looked at as a way to justify payment. And then the last 3 are very closely related. One is the analysis of your practice, the ability to do research based on your documentation, and then to look at the outcomes of your program. Technology considerations, I was laughing as I was putting this talk together. Historically, there's been about 25 slides in here on technology considerations, and the electronic health record world is changing so rapidly. I've substituted all of those slides with this one, which is good luck on that. If you're in an organization, you probably are going to get what the organization decides, whether that's good or bad for therapy. If you're on your own in a private practice, you may be quite frustrated looking at so many choices, and it may find that it's very difficult to differentiate between them. A third option, one that we've done in our organization, and I would not recommend it, is we actually created our own electronic health record. And that is rarely a very good choice. It can be incredibly expensive and incredibly frustrating. There are also some personnel considerations with documentation systems. One is the personnel's willingness to standardize, their sophistication and experience with automation. In some cases, and this is becoming less of an issue, do they have keyboard skills or any technology skills at all? Where are your people dispersed? What kind of hardware do you need, and how do they need to access it? If you're doing home care, for example, do they have access to the internet, and is it a consistent, persistent connection. In some areas in rural America, there is no connection. How does that information get back to, if you will, the mothership? And then also looking at your ability, both at a department and also at an organizational level, to support that automation. So when things break, when things go wrong, the old adage in the technology world is it's not a question of if your hard drive is going to crash, it's a question of when, and what sort of mechanisms do you have in place to safeguard against that. Here are some realistic expectations I think we can have for documentation systems. First of all, documentation is a major source of complaints by staff. It always will be. When you streamline this, no matter how efficient, no matter how perfect it is, it does not mean that those complaints are going to be eliminated. We all hate to document. Documentation is also the only source of credibility to many external agencies, and as such, it's not going away. One of the expectations I would hope that you would have is that you would want to avoid duplication and waste, and try to reuse and reduce and recycle information that you already have in multiple places. So things like just something as simple as the completion of the demographic information on any form could be done very, very simply by either technology or support staff. Those are some fairly low expectations, but I think we're in a very transitional period here. So those are what I would think would be some of the realistic expectations. I think productive documentation ends up being standardized across staff and site, especially when staff has to change from location to location, that you're looking for getting the maximum value from this documentation with minimum effort. You're looking at whenever possible, collecting data elements, not stories about patients, so that data can be analyzed, and that it should be coordinated with outcomes. Additionally, it needs to be timely, it needs to be attractive, it needs to be meaningful. The next system we want to talk about very briefly is, because this is partially a reimbursement program, is third-party relations. The interactions that we have with third-party payers, for example, to verify or get prior approval for care, for understanding what the rules are for the patient's insurance. So their purposes are, we want to assure that the patient gets appropriate treatment and that there's appropriate payment that's made. There also should be the purpose of working with the third-party payer for joint problem solving when things come up that are out of the ordinary, to anticipate potential problems specific to specific patients, and also a great opportunity here for marketing your practice to folks who actually can direct patients towards you. Looking at office systems, these are a long list of office systems that are there. Which ones are challenges for you is going to be up to you, but you can see that there is some overlap from the clinical. And just to run down them very briefly: patient scheduling, staff scheduling, billing, insurance verification, script reauthorization, referral routing, record completion, supply purchasing, routine typing, etc., data gathering, report preparation, and irregular office procedures are those things that come up every once in a blue moon. Scheduling is one we'll talk about, and we'll specifically want to mention the challenges of multidisciplinary schedule. Multidisciplinary scheduling is very difficult to handle from a technology standpoint because it is almost always individually negotiated. It can be very unprincipled. It sometimes is a miracle that it occurs at all, and very, very few people understand how it does actually happen. And that's a real challenge. I would suggest that scheduling occur with as much non-therapist intervention as possible, although clearly only the therapists can recognize what it is that the patients need at their core from a clinical standpoint. But this can be a tremendous time sink. The purposes of scheduling systems are to match a patient and a clinician, or a patient and a team of clinicians when it's multidisciplinary. It's also for scheduling, for communication. That communication is both internal and external. It is a group that do record keeping and data generation, and it can be used for data and practice analysis and research. Let's move on to billing. Billing is the process of assigning charges to patient services that then get sent off for payment, hopefully. I think we have to recognize right off the bat that there's a tremendous underbilling epidemic in our profession. We have a large number of individuals within all of the rehab disciplines that I believe suffer from a Peace Corps gene or a Robin Hood gene, where they're basically giving things away that may or may not be theirs. And one of the key questions is who assigns any coding that happens. Does this happen at a therapist level or at a clerical staff? And that's a discussion that hopefully we will talk about in some of the online groups. Lastly, our next, I'd like to talk about record completion. This is a problem for many, many therapists. Incomplete records are frequently a source of payment denial, and it is very common to hear stories of therapists that are significantly behind and very demotivated by it. It'll be necessary for you to track completion of records as part of the patient information system, and you can do this by integrating some of the schedule component to this, with regular reports to clinicians and updates. We also think it's very important that you build this very very low-level task into the performance appraisal and system, if you have one. In other words, that part of their job that they should be graded on is their ability to get records done. If you don't measure that, it is very likely that it can become a problem for you. Now, as we look at the systems, and we certainly haven't talked about all of them, there are some cautions that I want to talk about. Different settings will mean different productivity, and different types of patients will also mean different productivity. Support systems will have a tremendous impact on productivity, but there are no magic gold standards for systems. Systems are not everything, but they are important. They are the environment in which someone is trying to get work done. So hopefully, as we've talked about this today, you've gotten a little bit of a sense about some of the systems. I want to encourage you to complete the organizational system self-assessment and take a look at what are the things that are most significant challenges in your organization, and complete that for discussion, and including that in the discussion forums. Next, we'll be talking about the productive therapist, which is the clinical component of productivity, and how you as a manager can help work with individual clinicians for them to have individual behaviors in the clinic that will help them become more productive. As we do this, whether it's individual behaviors or whether it is systems, it's important that you all understand that there is a process in which change of any type is going to be accepted, and it's going to start with a focus on denial of the need to have change, resistance of that change. It'll move to an awareness of some of the possibilities. And then lastly, there'll be a commitment. These are very similar to the stages of grieving, and changes to some extent. It is a loss process and a regaining or a refocusing. So it's important to understand as you are getting resistance, or as people are working through the acceptance of change cycle, that you understand where each individual is within that process and have specific strategies to work with individuals to help them move on to the next stage. To try to go from denial to commitment, good luck. You're going to have to go from denial to resistance, from resistance to new awareness, from new awareness to commitment. At the end of the day, to overcome resistance, you want to, as much as possible, convert imposed change to initiated change. And that means it starts to feel, instead of to the staff as if something is being done to us, into something that is done by us. That will help. It's not always possible, but that is a good change management technique. Additionally, you're going to hear me talk about this several times throughout the course. In order for people to be successful at learning new skills and to accepting change, they're going to need to be able to do what I call handling the concept. And the example I always use is Rubik's Cube. You really can't tell someone how to do Rubik's Cube. You can't just tell them about it. You have to let them experience it. Additionally, as is the case with productivity and Rubik's Cube and many things in life, some of the rules are not yet known or may not even be knowable. And there also may be many years of bad behavior or unacceptable behavior or less than desirable behavior that may need to be unlearned. As such, what you want to do is give everybody an opportunity to handle it, to play with it. Make the assumption that everyone does their best, but remembering that skills are tedious to learn and even more tedious to unlearn. You're going to have to give them an opportunity to figure it out. As you go through the process of systems and individual productivity, it's going to be important that you continue to have communication with your staff and continue to ask the questions of your staff, such as, what do they think quality is? How do they know what quality looks like? When is it that they're doing so much that it can no longer be high quality or can no longer be good? Ask them what they've done to be more productive in the past. What have they learned already? Share with them what you've already learned. Ask how they go about documenting, especially the ones that are good. Not necessarily what kind of system do they use organizationally, but rather what's their process. There's also issues related to delegation and the use of support staff. Are they good delegators? What kinds of decisions do they make about delegation? What kind of systems do you have in place to prevent or to support that? And then one of the other questions is, is the focus of therapy going to be the patient or the therapist? And we'll talk much more about that when we get into the productive therapist. After you've asked those questions, you want to listen. And then you want to keep listening, and you want to keep letting them handle and Rubik's Cube this process. It will be a much more comfortable process for them, although it rarely is comfortable. It can be truly very uncomfortable if you don't follow these steps. But the concept here is to let them understand as professionals, let them discover, let them find what works for them, and help them along that change management life cycle. One of the things that you'll also find is that when you deal with productivity, it's going to challenge your values. It will help you clarify them. What are the important things? It's going to be important to focus on what is important, like someone you're going to meet in the productive therapist discussion called Phil, and try to recognize that it is likely that there will be some frustration, but try not to get frustrated. We've done this before, but we're going to do it again. Expectation planning. I think it's a key management tool. With your staff, ask them to define success as you become organizationally and individually more productive. If they are successful in becoming more productive, what will be different? What are they going to get out of it? What are going to be the things that have to be surrendered? I want you to be explicit and make public statements of the expectations, and I want you to ask your staff to do the same thing. And then check in regularly throughout the process to see how they're doing, much like we're going to do as we go through this course. Here's some cautions about system fixes. System fixes will probably be welcome, but will likely not be celebrated, at least for very long. So if you fix a bad meeting process, they're going to go, great, it doesn't stink anymore. It's not horrible anymore. They're not going to say, oh, it's wonderful. They're going to want to know why it wasn't fixed before. If you are familiar with the work of Hertzberg and his motivation hygiene theory, systems are hygiene things. The best you can get is not that people are going to get motivated because you fix systems. They're going to stop being demotivated. They're going to consistently ask you the question, for example, when you fix the documentation system, well, why didn't you fix it sooner? And that's something that you're going to have to deal with, and that is a very, very common. But system fixes, as welcome as they are, will not be celebrated. They will not pat you on the back, not carry you off and celebrate you as the great victor. They'll basically say, well, you finally did what you were supposed to do. Additionally, consider performance management issues in each system fix. So in other words, each time that you have a change to a system, whether that's a policy or a process, they're going to have to learn all the 6 steps of performance management. And not every system change will be perceived as a fix. Some might even be seen as a step not in the right direction. Also, as you make changes, especially to systems, there may be some folks that just are not interested in moving forward with you and may actually be casualties to the organization. The performance management part is the discussion that we have had already about Clay Carr's model, which is to be successful for every system fix, the worker must know what it is they're supposed to do, how to do it, have access to the tools to accomplish it, be motivated to succeed, take responsibility for their own success, and recognize success when it occurs. And if they fail in any one or more of these 6 aspects, it's very much more likely that they will not have a positive outcome. I want to very strongly encourage you to fill out or complete the self-assessment of organizational systems. And one of the questions is, who should be involved in that assessment? That's a political issue. And part of what's going to be happening is you may find that there are certain political implications of being perceived as criticizing systems within your organization, and I want you to be sensitive to that. So at least initially, you should fill this out yourself, and you may want to involve others on your team or your supervisor as you go forward. Also, one of the tools that we're going to be giving you next week, and actually it's available now, is the staff personal self-assessment, which is called the productivity quiz, which gives them a wide variety of techniques. You're going to ask them to try 2 to 3 and reflect. That's the play or experience or Rubik's Cube component of it. And then report back to you on how it went. Of the techniques that were there for improving productivity, how'd they go? Were there some that worked? Were there some that didn't? If there's some that didn't, let's try some other ones. And then go back and repeat, try a couple more, report back. And that's the cycle. That's the information I wanted to share with you on the Productive Clinic. Your job now is to go forward with the organizational system self-assessment, start to really reflect on the systems that you have in place, identify those which are the biggest challenge for you and most likely the ones that you're going to focus on to try to improve, to create an environment so people will be able to work more effectively. This is Peter Kovacek, and that is the end of this session on the Productive Clinic.